I'm now going to talk through 6 types of presentation methods and evaluate each one as we go. So presenting, as one sense of the word, is where we are giving information to someone else, and we may well use a distribution channel like the ones we've talked about so far in this topic to enable this presentation. But presentation in a slightly more narrow sense of the word, or just a presentation, is where we are usually talking about some speech made to an audience. So, I'm doing a presentation here, my audience isn't in person, you're watching it on YouTube, but this person here is presenting. Often slides are used, so some presentation software will create a slideshow, like this one. We've got a graph here, and they're good, if you're evaluating it, they're good because they can really help you demonstrate it with some evidence and also help reinforce the point. So he might be explaining what has happened to this company, but also the slide can help reinforce this. And because we have some direct audience who are being presented to, that often means we can have some interaction. There can be some questions or clarifications made if the audience are not sure, and that interaction is really valuable if you're wanting to also, collect information based on their reactions maybe, as well as presenting it. However, generally speaking, presentations are best for relatively small amounts of information. If you're wanting to communicate a massive amount of information, a presentation will just take far too long, will be so boring, and people will have quite a short attention span. So usually a presentation will only be 5 to maybe an hour. Beyond that is going to take too long and will be too boring. A second method which can overlap with presentations are reports. So a report is a spoken or written description of some event or investigation. So usually looking back at what's happened, you might recall hopefully from LO1, in evaluation phase we have a final evaluation report done by the project manager. It's essentially the last thing done in a project, where they write a report looking back at how the other phases went, pros and cons, and evaluating it critically. So it is usually looking back or either looking forward but based on some investigation. So often you associate with a report with some written document, and it usually is, but you can also have spoken reports as well. So there can be presentations too. So if you have, if you've been asked by a boss to make a report, you can always just present it like a normal presentation. And so that has the pros and cons, which we talked about. But in terms of a written report, usually they're created by either desktop publishing, if you're creating a really fancy, flashy report, or just simply a word processor. And in contrast to presentations, written reports are generally better suited for larger amounts of information. So you can have a massive report, which is, say, 200 pages long, and because someone is not sat there in an audience waiting for you to finish, it's a lot more suitable because you can just leave it if you get tired of reading, you can delve back into it at various points. So it's better for longer amounts of info. But of course, still, if you're reading it section by section, it can still become far too detailed and too boring, which is going to limit the effect of your information. So reports will often have a brief summary, often at the start, which will condense all of the key information to one paragraph or one page to try and counteract the fact that often they're too detailed and too boring, even if all of that detail is important for some readers. The next method, tables, are rarely on their own, so usually they're combined in reports or presentations. This is where we have data expressed in terms of rows and columns as opposed to just loads of text or numbers. So this is a table, we've got different columns with column headings, and they're good for headings in particular at grouping or categorizing data. So if you're wanting to group bits of data together, a table is good because you can just have a column for each group, or the rows will express different instances of that group. And as a presentation method, they are quite good at giving you a summary, right? You can often combine loads of different written data into a table to give a quick summary, but a table can be quite hard to visualize. This table here is about electricity consumption, but it's not really clear what it means or what it's trying to get across. So they can be quite hard to visualize, which will limit how much people can understand what is contained within the table. So tables are often converted, maybe with spreadsheet software, into graphs or charts. So these are objects which are going to help you visualize it more. So they visualize numerical information in particular. So a caveat with this is they can sometimes be overcomplicated. I'm sure you've seen graphs which just don't make any sense because they're so complicated. And it's why having labels like on the axes is really important. So there are different types of graphs I'll quickly go through. This one is a pivot chart, and a pivot chart is a way of summarizing a large data set. So a pivot table is what this graph is created from, and a pivot table is just a small table coming from a larger table essentially. So we're good at summarizing the data. And this is a line graph. A line graph is for continuous data. Continuous meaning that it's constantly changing. So we've got, the years on the x-axis here. We can look at every single day and have a data value. The data is constantly changing. Having a bar won't show the change, which is why the line connects different points. So speaking of bars, that pivot chart is effectively a bar chart, but this is another bar chart here. So bar charts are for discrete data. So we have continuous for line graphs, and bar charts are discrete data. Discrete meaning distinct, so where we can't really connect the points because it doesn't really make sense. Here we've got different quarters of the year, so every 3 months, and you can't really connect them because they're treated separately. A pie chart is really good at showing how different sizes, how different proportions all relate to each other. So we've got the total population of animals here and how many donkeys correspond to how many goats and so on. So the sizes are really clear just by looking at it. And finally, a dynamic chart is where we have some live data being showed. This is my live view counter. Every minute is shown as a bar here. And so this graph on YouTube will update automatically, so I can see where the views are coming from or not coming from every minute. So the other graphs here are static graphs or static charts. They're not updating as new data is coming in. So dynamic charts are nice because they can clearly show the changes over time and you can see them coming in live, but they can be quite distracting. If you're trying to give a presentation and people are just watching your live graph change, that is not necessarily helpful. And also, if you're trying to demonstrate a point, there's a chance that your live graph will not reflect it. Maybe the live data does not match what you are trying to explain. So they're not always amazing, but they are quite a nice tool for showing changes over time. Finally, there are 2 types of documents which are fairly simple to explain, thankfully. First of which are integrated documents. So an integrated document is where we combine multiple components in one document. So a bit like how multimedia combines different media, this just combines different components. So for example, you may have a written report with some tables and graphs and charts inside it. And also maybe you have a screenshot from a database. Any mix of different data combined in one document is an integrated document. Integration means put together. These are good because each component can help support each other. So you might be writing about something in a written report and use a table or graph to back up your point as evidence maybe. But they can sometimes overcomplicate things. If you've got a table and a graph and a screenshot for the same point, that may be a bit unnecessary and may overcomplicate things. And the final presentation method to talk about is going back really to LO1 here and talking about end user documentation. So this is where we are at the end of evaluation producing some documentation, some document, usually a written document, to give to our user so they can use your product. So often like a user guide explaining how to operate your product maybe. So because it's aimed at a user and not a employee, usually they're quite simple and not very technical, which is good because they're easy to understand usually. But to kind of support this, you must make sure your information is concise. If you have just designed a product, it's quite tempting to write loads of stuff about it, but honestly, you're not going to help anyone by writing loads of stuff about it. Keeping it shorter is better because the user is more likely to actually use your documentation.